Um, Now, as far as I think we are concerned, we would very much wish to propose that Robert Adam be seen as one of the most interesting and contributive people who have worked in British architecture. He possesses, as everybody knows here, a very big popular reputation. However, even a modest exposure to Adam's scholarship suggests to all of us that the commonplace view of Adam, which sees him as a highly inspired, decorative genius, needs not only to be extended and expanded, but moreover shifted onto a totally new wavelength. One which views him as one of the greatest creative talents in the architectural world, certainly in the whole of the 18th century, but also as one who succeeded in taking advantage of the situation in which he found himself. 2 years ago, we were very fortunate to have here at the AA a very provoking series of presentations about Robert Adam by one of today's contributors, Alistair Rowan. Alistair, during these talks, opened up for us an impressive agenda of concerns. Perhaps the sort of agenda that should be more widely acknowledged in the historiography of history. One in which Robert Adams' complexity and richness as a figure in a historical context was particularly highlighted. We heard, of course, about Adam in the Scotland phase, the Italian days, the London practice, but also about the many-sided life that he led. We heard about his socializing, promotionalizing, and what we might even call today his commercializing side. We also heard about his political activity, remembering that he was MP for Kinross-shire. We heard about his strong interests in his family business as builders, with the standards that were demanded of his buildings, and so on. Not to mention hearing about the great built achievements themselves, in addition to his very significant, which we again are going to hear about today, late unbuilt work designed in times of economic depression, perhaps reminding us of today. But it's this sort of rich historiography that Robert Adam and his family story demand if we're going to gain any sort of a overall picture, not only of achievements, but also of the conditions under which these achievements were produced. Pressures which could be found in England and Scotland in this period of the Enlightenment, when there were many competing enterprises, but at the same time, when the competing architect and I'm not going to suggest that these were egalitarian times, faced both great opportunities but also formidable opponents and challenges. So, in our meeting today, I would hope that some of these, plus a lot of others, are going to be kind of questions that we might be looking at. Now, I would just like to say a very quick word about the meeting today and how it has been set up. First of all, we would like to see today as an interactive occasion between speakers and audience. So we've put aside a certain amount of time, as you may see from your program, for general discussion. The model for the day, therefore, will comprise of 5 separate 40-minute presentations by John Wilton Ely, Eileen Harris, Giles Worsley, Frank Kelsall and Alistair Rowan. With each of these followed by short 15-minute responding sessions in which the respondents may choose to directly respond to the material or otherwise to add to or to complement it, possibly both of these. And our respondents today include John Newman, Peter Thornton, Margaret Richardson, Ian Gow and John Harris. Each speaker and respondent will then be followed by an open discussion period from the floor for about 20 minutes. And the day will conclude with a summing up, or better still, maybe a reopening up session from Professor Robin Middleton. So I think that's all I want to say, and I'd like now to come to introduce our first speaker, John Wilton Ely, who is currently the Director of Educational Studies at Sotheby's, and he is also the author of a lot of texts, including The Mind and Art of Giovanni Battista Piranesi. So please let me introduce to you John Wilton Ely. John.
I shall leave the lights down. Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, while the visual aids are being put into operation, I'm going to be talking this morning to you really about an aspect of the Italian years. When I planned this talk in the context of this conference, some distance ahead, I gave myself a rather broad remit within which to operate, particularly as I happen at the moment to be working on an exhibition on Piranesi as an architect, which opened in Rome just over 10 days ago, and has thrown some interesting light on Piranesi's own architectural achievements, which of course are directly, as I hope you will see, interrelated with Adam's formative years in Italy. The title of my talk, in fact, Amazing Fancies, many of you will recognize, of course, is the phrase that occurs in Robert Adams' rather breathless letter back to his family, reporting on his initial contact with Piranesi. And the main drift of my talk this morning is to stress the role, the catalytic role, of fantasy through Piranesi in Adam's work. This is nothing new, After all, Borromini, who Piranesi greatly admired, was himself a great fantasist in a sense that many of his most productive ideas developed out of fantasia. But I want to stress particularly, as we shall see in specific instances, how Piranesi's militant attitude from his very early years to his dying years, right in the end of the 70s there, was concerned with the use of fantasy as a means of exploring architectural ideas. And certainly this is one of the crucial legacies, in my opinion, that he passes on essentially to Robert, although I shall also talk about James Adam as well in the context of Piranesi. I have the first two slides, please. Incidentally, I haven't been shown how to move them on because I prefer to move my own slides. Thank you.
That's the left, forward, that's the right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Reverse them.
Yes, sure. Thank you. On the 18th of June in 1755, we have the first impact of these two remarkable men together recorded in the letter that John Fleming publishes in his famous book, which has been such a seminal insight into the early years of Robert Adam. We still remain in John Fleming's debt for putting those letters into circulation. And in that letter, Robert Adam talks with great enthusiasm. He says, Piranesi, who I think is the most extraordinary fellow I ever saw, has become immensely intimate with me. And as he imagined at first that I was like other English who had a love of antiques without knowledge, upon seeing some of my sketches and drawings was so highly delighted that he almost ran quite distracted and said I had more genius for the true noble architecture than any Englishman ever that was in Italy. Well, of course, we know how Adam liked to talk himself up, and that comes out very immediately in this. But it is essentially perfectly true, as it happens, and very often is the case, that this was a momentous experience, and that I think already Piranesi, who was no bad judge of people, began to realize he was dealing with somebody who was rather different from the average, what appeared to be a milordo inglese, because as we know, Adam arrived in Italy very much under a facade, so that he could penetrate into those sort of inner circles of patronage before he then ripped off the disguise and became a true architect. There's also this fascinating phrase, which again gives us a marvelous pen picture of Piranesi seen from the English eyes, or British eyes, I should put it more accurately. The famous phrase that Piranesi is such a disposition as bars all instruction, his ideas and locution so ill-arranged, his expression so furious and fantastic, that a Venetian hint is all that can be got from him, never anything fixed or well digested, so that a quarter of an hour makes you sick of his company. Well, that doesn't sound a very promising start in a relationship which was to be immensely productive and really to last their lifespans, because although I should be only talking about the Italian years, as we know, they kept a very close relationship through correspondence right into the years of the 70s, when Adam was doing that crucial change in his style, producing the Etruscan style, and also, of course, his fireplace designs were greatly indebted to the Diverse Maniere, that crucial book in 1769 that Piranesi published, which made a great impact in its various ways. There is, of course, the figure, as I know John Newman will be saying something about later, of Clerisot, and with the new Life of Clerisot by Tom McCormick recently on the bookshelves, we have an opportunity to judge whether Clerisot was so significant as one wondered in the past. Certainly Clerisot was, if you like, the contact man who brought Piranesi and Adam together. As you will know, Adam met Clerisot in Florence in the previous February to that meeting with Piranesi, and already he recognized in Clerisot an extremely useful vehicle to educate him in the skills of draftsmanship. And I think that is essentially, in my opinion, still where we see Clerisot, very much a fine stylist, groomed in the very highest level of the French Academy, and the Getzi cartoon there gives us something of the nature of the man. And I put on the right-hand screen the drawing school by Natoire, the director of the French Academy at that time, showing the French students at Palazzo Mancini, the academy in Rome that was to be so crucial in the early years or both of Piranesi and later of Adam. There's phrases in the Adam letters to characterize what Adam saw in Clericeau, even at this stage. Even in Florence, he reports that Clericeau draws in architecture delightfully in the free manner I wanted. And then he goes on to talk about that he's carrying to Rome to Clericeau, who will put me in a method of improving myself more in drawing and architecture than I had any ideas of. And I think this stylist, this way of fine draftsmanship, and the sort of skills, as it were, the technology, if you like, of drawing and so on, is one of the most important roles of Clericeau. But I think there's very little evidence, even with the presentation of the material in the new McCormick book, to show that there's any great fundamental changes of vision that Clericeau could have brought into Adam's way of thinking about architecture in a way that Piranesi did. So Clericeau, as it were, comes into the circle and is important in that role. But then, of course, Piranesi himself, we have plenty of evidence on his intentions, what we would now call, I suppose, his architectural philosophy. 1743, the Prima Parte, this first book that he published, which was to have been followed by other works which never happened, was unreservedly concerned in shock therapy in the architectural profession of the time. In other words, he takes the capriccio, the ruined fantasy, so to speak, or the architectural fantasy, and he uses it quite clearly, according to the dedication to Nicola Giobbe, the Venetian builder to which that book was dedicated. It's essentially to galvanize people's imagination, to jolt them out of their complacency. He was certainly not very excited when he arrived in Rome, Piranesi, to find Rome with such great monuments from the past and with such little inspiration in evidence, most on the recent buildings that were going up, such as the Lateran facade of Galilei, Fuga's, various buildings and so forth, Van Vitelli. It was certainly, from Piranesi's point of view, not a particularly seminal period in Roman architecture. You could argue, of course, there were sour grapes, the building boom had gone, he had no chance to do the sort of things he wanted himself, but it is interesting to notice right through Piranesi's years that he sustains this message of really being an amanuensis, or an intermediary between the genius and the brilliance of antiquity and his own day. And this fascinating image, which still is one of the most remarkable self-portraits by an architect, insofar as it certainly was drawn by Piranesi, even if it was actually etched by Polenzani, shows him as he wished to be seen. It appears twice in his works as the Janus figure, so to speak, looking back to the past as an antique statue, looking forward as a modern designer to the future when he could, as it were, transmit these ideas for his contemporaries. And this is very much, as it were, the theme of that relationship with Adam all the time, this idea of stimulus and giving, as it were, a kind of new idea of how one could develop the boundaries of architectural experience and experiment. As John Harris has shown, those crucial years when Piranesi had strong impact upon the pensionnaire at Palazzo Mancini can be shown when we look at the Le Lorrain Chinea design of 1746 on the left, the Temple of Vesta, next to one of those incredible confections which had been put up in the past in the Baroque style, this amazing thing in Piazza Navona, which you see by Panini, that is the painting by Panini, showing all these additional bits round the side of the Bernini fountain there, of the kind of Baroque style which obviously was getting immensely retardataire. And this very elaborate kind of architecture to be replaced by the austere, highly sort of functionalist, column-bearing kind of architecture that you see in the Chinea design. Now this, of course, is closely related to Piranesi's own thinkings. After all, he was working right opposite the French Academy in the Corso as a print seller, had a very close contact with the French pensionnaire at that particular time, and in many ways his ideas from the Mausoleo, that fantasy I showed you just now, is one of the many new ideas which were clearly influencing Petitot and others, Le Lorrain, Le Jay and so forth, in the 40s, as it were, the decade before Adam arrives. Well, when Adam arrives, he has the full benefits of Piranesi's new catalytic vision with the presentation of two fine drawings. And here again is Adam himself in July writing back about the amazing and ingenious fancies Piranesi has produced in the different plans of the temples, baths and palaces and other buildings I never saw, the greatest fund for inspiring and instilling invention in any lover of architecture that can be imagined. And then with a slight smug feeling, he says, Chambers, who courted Piranesi's friendship with all the assiduity of a lover, never could bring him even to do a sketch of any one thing, and told me I would never be able to get anything from Piranesi. So much is Chambers out of his calculation that Piranesi has told me that whatever I want of him he will do for me with pleasure, and is just now doing 2 drawings for me which will be both singular and clever. Well, here's one of the singular and clever drawings on the left. They're both, of course, in the Syon Museum today. And it's very interesting to notice the strong resemblances, of course, to the Carceri. I am, in fact, showing you the second state of the Carceri print, which is relevant there on the right-hand screen, which actually dates from the 1760s. But it is, if you like, the drawing on the left was an intermediary stage for the first state, which had appeared in 1745 or thereabouts. And it is, in a sense, to underline what I've always maintained, that the Carceri are not really concerned with Masonic symbolism and all sorts of other things which have been offloaded onto them with a great deal of ideology and care, but they really are a testbed of architectural experiment. Certainly the first state is full of those elements of architectural exploration, of structure and space and so forth, which is a very personal document in Piranesi's life as he was entering the Roman world for the first time. And significantly, when he re-etched those plates in 1760, such as you see on the right, he is now confronted with the vigor of the Greco-Roman controversy, where he's very much on the defensive against those who are claiming that Greece was superior to Rome. So the fantasy there is very much a testbed of ideas for Piranesi, and indeed was to become such for Robert Adam with that kind of world. After all, with people like Laugier, 1753, the Essai sur l'Architecture, Leroy, 1758, publishing his book on the ruins of Greece and so forth, extravagant claims were being made for the Greek achievements, and of course, more and more, Piranesi began to see the French Academy as it were, the centre of that Philhellene world. And it's noticeable how he shifts across to the Britons, essentially in the 50s, away from the French Academy, as he becomes more and more alienated by the preposterous claims, which, of course, in fairness, he made equally preposterous claims on the other side in the battle of ideologies. The other famous drawing, the amazing fancy, which Piranesi produces, one which is frequently illustrated. It's in John Fleming's book on the left there from the Sode Museum, a very beautiful pen and chalk drawing, very large, unfinished, but fizzes and bubbles with interest and novelty and inspiration. And again, it's remarkable how close it comes to the frontispiece, to the second volume of the Antiquità Romane, this famous 4-volume work which appeared in 1756, in the time that Adam was actually with Piranesi in Rome. Now, the Antiquità Romane was yet another dimension to this crusading zeal of Piranesi of using archaeology to galvanize the present. It was not produced, essentially, for the antiquarians. The preface to that major volume, or series of volumes, makes it quite clear that he is digging up the past, so to speak, for the present benefits. And the key to the understanding of that incredible Via Appia on the right there is that it's an apotheosis of Roman funerary design. Every possible funerary monument he can cram in is put there. And the very fact that it is, if you like, a kind of frontispiece to one of 2 volumes, a central 2 volumes of the 4, which are concerned with tomb design in the Antiquità, is all about the inspiration that one can get from funerary architecture. And the fact that that is an inspirational statement, that fantasy at the front, because of course so many of the plates afterwards, which are rarely seen by archaeologists to this day, are very clinical diagrams and sections and details of tombs. This, in a sense, is to say that this is a fund of inspiration for the present. And as many people will know, there are a number of monuments to living personalities in Rome actually incorporated into that particular composition. Adam, again, in a slight smugness, I think, was delighted to find that he himself was incorporated into that great Valhalla, along with Alan Ramsay, the Scottish portrait painter. In 1756, Adam refers to this in a letter. He said, "In one of the frontispieces representing the Appian Way in all its ancient splendor, with all its mausoleums of the consuls, emperors, etc., Piranesi is taking the occasion to put in Ramses' name and mine, with our elogiums, as if buried in these tombs." Well, there is the detail on the left of the inscription to Robert Adam, saying what a wonderful man he was and so forth. And I always find it rather amusing to look at the she-wolf of Rome, which of course is based on a famous bronze in the Piranesi Museum, because of course it well may refer to the Adam brothers. Certainly, I think Piranesi was not averse to having sort of little visual sort of jokes, as it were, organized within this. But the fact is that Adam is given a place within this major work, even in a very modest way, shows the continuation of that relationship. And, of course, it was to be testified in even more important ways at a later stage. The change in the Adam style of experimental fantasy, of course, is dramatically shown when one looks at the drawings in the Syon Museum, from works such as the one on the left to the very famous, and only, of course, a portion of the entire drawing on the right, which is very much larger than what you see on the screen there. There's another third in both directions, and there's a larger scale than the image you see. Shows the rapidly, within a year, maturing vision of Adam using Piranesi's skills to experiment freely with the fantasia and to use the capriccio in a way that it had never really been used, certainly since perhaps the time of Borromini. We see this, of course, in the internal experiments that Adam is conducting. The drawing on the left, which owes a lot to Clerisot, is, of course, a key statement of that relationship, because Clerisot, if you like, again, was the stylist who went over the rather inexpert drawings of Robert at the early stages, improved them, redid them, and so forth. But really, in a way, when you look at the Piranesi Ginnasio Antico on the right, which is contemporary with that drawing, and is clearly one of the sources for it, you can see how essentially Adam is learning direct from Piranesi to organize screens of columns, coffered recessions, the whole spatial development that we see in the Great Hall at Zion at a later stage. All of that is, as it were, foretold in those experimental fantasies. And then when we look at Adam again in another of his internal fantasies of the middle years in Rome, fascinatingly it comes remarkably close to the Cinquecento Mannerist style of people like Giulio Romano. I found no evidence, actually, that Adam went to Mantua. He went up to Ravenna, of course, and he sketched San Vitale and so forth, but even so, the resemblances to the Giulio Romano style is not without significance, because Piranesi himself was a great admirer of what we would now call the Mannerists, people like Peruzzi, Ligorio, and so forth, because, again, of their rich fantasy and their complexity of the use of antiquity, which was so distinctly in contrast to the world of the Philhellenes, the Logiers, the Rigoristi, who believed that architecture should be reduced to a bare essential. Another dimension of this educational process in which Adam's mind was opened wider by Piranesi was, of course, their sketching expeditions. He and Clerisot and Ramsay went off to Tivoli, among other places, to sketch and draw. And I put the Adam drawing of what is known as the larger baths at Tivoli on the right there, next to, of course, one of the most magnificent of the Veduti di Roma by Piranesi, which is actually etched at a later date, but certainly is based on drawings done at that time with Adam. And one can see again how the Adam vision is expanded by looking, as it were, through Piranesi's eyes at the splendor and also the formal complexity of Roman elements. I put the Derby House drawing room on the right, not because there's any direct connection there, but it's the way that Adam's mind is educated by Piranesi, his visual awareness is heightened, that is so important in these early stages. Going to Herculaneum, of course, as we know, was a very limited experience at the time. The excavations were confined to caves, only fragments were found. Adam was forced to go elsewhere to look at, obviously, the Golden House of Nero and a variety of other more extant works. We still don't know exactly where that drawing on the right was done by Adam, but it's very likely to have been done in Rome at the Golden House rather than anywhere else. And it shows, again, the widening of Adam's repertoire. Again, it's Piranesi's interest in Cinquecento design, the Mannerist sources. This is a Clerisot drawing of Villa Madama, But again, it's through the Piranesian circle that Adam is widening his knowledge to draw in, as a second hand, so to speak, from antiquity, the whole range of the grotesque style into his world. Piranesi, as I've said, had a great admiration for Ligorio, particularly the Casino of Pius V, Pius IV rather, I put on the left, which is a work that he particularly admired. Undoubtedly, he and Adam discussed that particular brittle use of delicate stucco forms and the enrichment, which again is in distinct and stark contrast to the Philhellene aesthetic as it's developing further. And although this is, of course, after Adam's departure back to England, the facade of Piranesi's only known work, the facade of the Knights of Malta's church, is filled of that Ligorian delicacy and richness which, in a sense, was passed on to Adam. As a matter of interest, the Syon Museum does contain among the Adam drawings a full rendering of that facade by Piranesi. It's not in Adam's hand. It's difficult to know exactly where it came from, but he did at least possess a full drawing of the entire facade, including the attic story, which was bombed off by the Risorgimento at a later stage. Interestingly, another Adam reference, so to speak, within that facade are the Sphinx capitals with the Rezzonico towers at the top of them, which comes from a fragment of one of these highly ingenious adaptations of the Ionic order that Piranesi includes in his book Delle Magnificenze in 1761. Now, he tells us elsewhere that Adam possessed one of the similar Sphinx-like capitals in his own collection. I've never actually found any evidence of this in the Adam papers. Even the little sketch drawing of the fragments that Adam was to put together back in England, sent back to James to arrange, doesn't include this. But on the other hand, the fact that Piranesi shows Adam how to use the ingenuity, as it were, that the ancients themselves had done to change their architecture is significant in this. Planning is, of course, in itself a major innovation in Adam's thinking through Piranesi. I think it speaks worlds to look at the Chamber's reaction to this incredible compilation, the famous Collegio of 1750, which certainly Adam would have been aware of. As you probably know, Chambers refers to this in a scathing comment to his students, so to speak, in the Treatise on Civil Architecture, and he talks about a celebrated Italian architect or artist whose taste and luxuriance of fancy were unusually great, the effect of whose compositions on paper has seldom been equalled, knew little of construction or calculation, yet less of the contrivance of habitable structures or the modes of carrying real works into execution, though styling himself an architect. And when some pensioners of the French Academy at Rome in the author's hearing charged him with ignorance of plans, he composed a very complicated one, since published in his work, which sufficiently proves that the charge was not altogether groundless. Well, from the point of Adam, we see again this interest in the complexity of planning. The very visit to Ravenna to look at San Vitale is a remarkable indication of, in my opinion, how Piranesi educates Adam to look at a very wide range of ancient architecture of all periods, to look at the spatial complexity, and the drawings I put on the right-hand screen testify to this very exploratory world that's going on in Adam's mind at this time. But in a way, the apotheosis of this relationship in terms of particular plan forms and complexity and their whole relationship at large appears in what I consider to be one of the most significant works that Piranesi ever published, and is significant in a variety of ways. First of all, it was dedicated to Robert Adam, a very unusual and rare thing on a large scale to dedicate a very costly publication to a fellow designer. This is, of course, I'm referring to the Campo Marzio, published in 1762, but certainly being developed at the time that Adam was with Piranesi. In fact, in the introduction, in the dedication, I translate here, Piranesi says, "I remember when we were in Rome together a few years ago, how enthusiastically you examined each of the many surviving monuments of the Romans. You asked me to engrave the remains of the buildings in that famous part of the city, to produce a bird's-eye view of the whole area. I am rather afraid that some parts of the campus, which I described, should seem figments of my imagination, and not based on any evidence. Certainly if anyone compares them with the architectural theory of the ancients, he would see that they differ greatly from it. and are not actually close to the usage of our own times. But I think that this shows, again, another dimension that, in a way, the Campo Marzio is to show the evolution of simplicity to complexity, to turn the Winckelmann whole theory about ancient art on its head. After all, Winckelmann believed that everything had gone from bad to worse as antiquity had proceeded. But you see on the right a group of plans superimposed showing the Campo Marzio, or the Campus Martis area from its very earliest origins, gradually getting more and more complex as time goes on, and then, as it were, exploding in this incredible work, the Iconographia, as it's called, this great six-plate plan, which actually is even larger than it is on the screen there, and I'm just showing you a detail on the right. Now, this very work is dedicated specifically to Robert Adam, quite apart from the book at large. We know from the Adam correspondence that when Adam was about to leave Rome to go back to England via Dalmatia, he was actually seeing Piranesi etching this particular plan, in fact dated 1757 on the actual plan itself. And there is, of course, at the very top of the work, as you see there, this remarkable puff, as it were, for Adam. And in Adam's words, we can hardly do better than this. He says, as he describes it to his family back there in April the 9th, 1757, he said, "In the most simple way that could be invented in Latin to this purpose, Piranesi has written, 'To Robert Adam Britton, patron of architecture, this plate of Campus Martis is dedicated by John Battista Piranesi.' Then, on a frieze above, is a medal, where fame points to a piece of architecture and leans on my shoulder in the attitude of going off to proclaim my praises. Round the medal is this inscription, Robert Adam, architect, member of the Academy of St. Luke at Rome and of Florence, and of the Institute of Bologna, all in Latin. In another medal, Piranesi has put my head and his own joined, forming a Janus, or double-headed head, with both the names of the dedicator and dedicated on it, and this was not finished when I saw it." Well, the Campo Marzio was a very important statement of intent by Piranesi, because the great plan is a complete anthology of achievement in planning forms. It bears little relation, of course, to archaeological fact, but the reverberations of that map, which is certainly intended for a generation or so of architects, can be traced to Saône, to Newforge, to Ledoux. A whole variety of people were inspired by the Iconographia. Manfredo Tafuri has suggested that that great plan is, in a sense, the statement of, as it were, a discontented artisan, Piranesi, in terms of the Enlightenment and rationalism, and it's, as he called it, a negative utopia. But I think if you read the dedication in the Piranesi phrases to Adam, it's quite clear it's a very positive utopia. It's very much concerned with stimulating the imagination in planning terms. And of course, when you look at the development at Zion of the plan, of course, are very modest in comparison to the Iconographia. It's just the way that Adam thinks so freely about planning shapes and the ingenuity, which is part of that education that has been going on in Italy. Of course, there is a tribute directly here in the Works in Architecture, which came out in the second volume, where the engraved elevation there, the sectional elevation on the right-hand screen of the hall at Zion, is actually etched by Piranesi in Rome and is one of 4 plates contributed by Piranesi to that work. And it's clearly, again, a tribute by Piranesi to that lasting friendship. Well, finally, in my last few minutes, James. What happens in his relationship with Adam? Well, it's interesting that James really felt that he hadn't achieved much. He was quite frank. He said, "I believe that biographers will choose to pass over this part of my life in profound silence." And I think in some ways it was probably justified. You can tell by the irascible and frustrated comments of his brother back in England that James, or Jamie, was not using his time properly. Even that portrait by Alan Ramsay 10 years previously shows the slightly over-precious, slightly foppish element of James, who was much more interested in his lace ruffs. But what is interesting is the last thing I want to say is that in 1765 appears this remarkable double work, or triple work, rejoinder to Mariette about the Greco-Roman controversy, where Piranesi states unreservedly the most important credo that he believed in free design. The Osservazioni, which is the observations on Mariette's letter, and you see literally sort of line by line, Piranesi takes Mariette apart, perhaps rather heavily in this particular way. He wants to make the claim it is the practicing architect The tools of the trade on the frontispiece on the right there are contrasted with Mariette's left hand writing his letter as an armchair critic. Piranesi is stressing the fact it is only the practicing architect who can understand the business of design. And the vignettes in that book, in the Parere, as it's called, the debate between two architects, shows again this freedom, almost quasi-neo-mannerist, really, in the handling of architectural forms, in total reaction to the world of the astringency, the rigoristi. The debate takes place very briefly between two architects, Didascolo and Protopiro. Protopiro is the man who supports the Logier's side, the rigoristo, as it were, and Didascolo is Piranesi's voice, as it were. And it really outlines a very basic ideology in conflict, which we still have with us to this day, between astringency and doctrinaire theories in architecture, a kind of orthodoxy, if you like, and the belief in free and multiple and pluralistic approaches to design. It's a very remarkable statement for its time, really, in many ways. Now, interestingly, in that dialogue, at one moment, Didascolo breaks out to point that, in fact, there is a case of a remarkable instance of free design being shown by a great friend of him, a Mr. Adams. Now, he's actually referring, as it happens, to James's plan for Houses of Parliament, which James was developing in Rome during the 3 years that he was there in Piranesi's company. Here again, freely translated, Didascolo in the Parere says that there's a building in London by Senior Adams, he uses the word S, interestingly enough, which is well known to one of the most discriminating, to be one of the most discriminating architects of our time. By chance, I have the piece in my pocket. Wait a moment. Listen. Mr. Adams, and he quotes from this press cutting, Mr. Adams distinguishes himself not only by the grandeur of his ideas, but by the way they're expressed. This designer has exhibited on a number of occasions a design which has gained him the universal admiration of all connoisseurs. It involves a project for a sumptuous building which combines not only the theories of the Houses of Parliament, but the learned societies of Britain. This vast scheme, whose character is worthy of the magnificence of a great nation, is particularly remarkable for the dignity and decorum expressed by all its elements, in combining the finest style of the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. The intelligence and order with which the main themes of English history are conveyed in Mr. Adams' bas-reliefs merits the highest praise. Well, then he goes on to refer to the order. Then he talks about this new order of architecture known as the British order. It's not necessary to create a totally new order to introduce fresh ornaments into the capital and other areas. If you consider the constituents of the Corinthian order, you will find a variety of solutions in the minor details, while still keeping the basic properties. And of course, James, in that famous portrait by Battoni, very much the Milordo Inglese, very much, you can just pick out very faintly, just below his hand, the lion and unicorn capital, which was one of the things that Piranesi is referring to in this particular area. My last two slides pose an interesting point. While organizing the exhibition at the American Academy of the Lateran drawings by Piranesi, which were being developed from the 60s onwards, the baldacchino on the right, which is one of the drawings that is related to Piranesi's design for remodeling the liturgically eastern end of the Lateran, have remarkable affinities to James's design for a baldacchino for the Houses of Parliament. And I feel in some ways, again, that this is the impact of Piranesi on James. I have very little doubt that it's not James's originality that is shown so much in the ornamental language, but again, it's the proximity of these two people together. And so, although James is not the high achiever that his brother was, there is a relationship in those Italian years which can be still put down to Piranesi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I please now call on John Newman, who is the Deputy Director of the Fulton Institute and currently the President of the Society of Architects and Historians, who is going to give us the response to that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I feel a little nervous at being a respondent, not quite sure how to go about it, and assuming that one of the roles of the respondent is to put the boot in. And I think that the main thing that I would like to say is, as John has already mentioned, I thought it might be a good idea to concentrate on Clerisot in particular, is to stress what seems to me the message that Clerisot was dinning into Robert's ears as they were working together in Robert's apartment and as they were sketching together in various parts of Italy. And surely what he was saying was copy, copy, copy. That was what Clerisot had been made to do when he was a student at the French Academy. You remember that eventually he fell out of the French Academy. That was over a purely technical disciplinary matter, and presumably Clerisot accepted the rationale of the French Academy's training, which was very much encouraging people to immerse themselves in the whole classical tradition. Perhaps at the French Academy the emphasis being more on Renaissance and Baroque architecture than on the antique. But it's quite clear, and this comes out in McCormick's book very strongly, that Robert made many drawings that are very closely based, or closely related, I should say, to two drawings by Clerisot. Perhaps they were sitting side by side and drawing the same thing. Perhaps Robert was being encouraged to copy drawings by Clerisot. And John quoted the two remarks in 1755 that Robert put in his letters back home about Piranesi. The first one, full of enthusiasm, written in June, but the second one, and John quoted it fully, written in October, now much more puzzled, saying that a Venetian hint is all that can be got from Piranesi. This sounds as if Clerisot's line has been getting through to Robert, and that he is feeling that the inspirational side of Piranesi's influence is something dangerous. And of course, Clerisot, again and again, discouraged Robert from free invention until he had mastered the vocabulary of antiquity. And so that, I think, is extremely important. And when one is looking at Robert Adams' executed architecture, one surely must see it as an attempt to revive for modern uses the architecture and decoration of the antique. I'm also struck, looking at the range of drawings that Robert Adam and Clerisot did during these years, how many of the drawings are of interiors. We saw one of the vaulted interiors at Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli, and it's clear also that Robert Adam was looking at the remains of antique stucco work. We've seen that as well. And I think that the influence of Clerisot is probably particularly important in developing Robert's interest in interior decoration. You're seeing, perhaps slightly prematurely, I didn't mean this to come and sort of stare at you for minutes on end, the rather, what I would see, unimpressive result of all this, when Robert got back to London, he came back with his trunks and portfolios full of evidence, real fragments of antique sculpture and funerary caskets and so on, and sheaves of drawings made from antique remains. And of course, as we've seen, also some highly unrealistic fantasy drawings, designs. But when he's actually up against it and he gets his first commission, he falls back on a very tried formula. And here is this very standard comparison between the decorated vaulted coved ceiling at Hopeton on the left, a work of the Adam Practice that represents the sort of essentially Rococo style, which was their style for interior decoration just immediately before Robert Adam set off to Italy. And on the right is Robert's design for the first room that he constructed and decorated in the addition to the house of General Bland at Thistleworth of 1758. And the way in which the ceiling is laid out and the way in which he proposes to apply decoration to the various parts is extremely similar. One really would think that he didn't need to go and spend 2.5 years in Italy to come up with something like that. All that has happened is that the decorative vocabulary has changed, and rinceaux and palmettes take the place of Rococo rocaille forms. As you remember, Robert Adam was vexed with the effect of the room, the new room at Thistleworth, and he blamed the craftsman for the poor effect. And Paul Drury's extremely interesting article on Joseph Rose's workshop remains at Audley End show that Robert soon took trouble to remedy the shortcomings of the craftsman and developed a whole new technique which made it possible to reproduce the small-scale, flat, tight, delicate style of antique stucco work, which is what he was aiming at. So one mustn't judge him by this first immature work. But I also, and may I now know how to press these buttons, my next pair is a reminder of a room very familiar, thank you, familiar to everybody, the painted room at Spencer House, which Robert visited shortly, probably as soon as the scaffolding came down, and you remember his sneers at it. He thought it was pitifulissimo. It may be Greek to the teeth, but my God, it is not handsome. But compared with his own achievements in practical architectural design, this surely is a work full of new ideas. And much in Adam's own later interior decoration surely must owe something to the painted room at Spencer House, Athenian Stuart's great early masterpiece. I think one could certainly condemn certain aspects of the painted room as being unhappy, not in the best taste. I think there is a very awkward, often an awkward relationship between different scales of the different elements, and one can quite see that Robert might justifiably criticize this room. But as I say, the really important thing is that there are many new ideas here. And what seems to be the case is that under the blinkered tuition of Clérisseau, Robert takes time to sort of change gear when he gets into practice and to see how he can harness his own experiences of antique work and to take advantage, and we know he's always on the lookout for this, how to take advantage of other people's work as well. And of course, Diverse Maniere is again a case in point. Piranesi's chimneypiece designs that only became available to Robert in the early 70s, he makes specific use of, both in terms of precise copying and also in terms of rethinking his own decorative style in reaction to Piranesi's designs. And yet some of the ideas that are in Diverse Maniere are also in there, in Stuart's work, so much earlier in that drawing dated 1759. Let's see. You remember that Robert had a scheme for keeping Clericeau under Adam family control for years ahead, and he wanted his brothers to come out one by one and be tutored by Clericeau, and not only to gain from Clericeau's tuition, but to prevent Clericeau from going off and helping somebody else. One might think that when this didn't happen, Robert might have wanted to hide the fact that he had owed so much to Clericeau, but he didn't. I think it's a point worth making, I'm sure this isn't a new point of mine, that some of the most classic interiors by Robert Adam of his early maturity, such as the walls here of the dining room at Osterley, have large ruin paintings in them, which are very close to capriccio designs of ruins by Clericeau, and which Robert had learnt to design and execute under Clericeau's tuition as a rather unsatisfactory Clericeau on the right. And I think yes, and sorry, that doesn't come out very well, but there is a detail of one of the designs for the interior of 20 Portman Square, Syon House, showing that in the back parlour he also there in the 1775, as late as that, still envisaged large ruin paintings. In many of his classic materials, his debt to Clericeau is fully expressed. And so I think there is much room for debate as to the influence of Clericeau vis-à-vis the influence of Piranesi on Adam, and at that point I'll hand over to the floor.
Thank you very much.
Established architect, which quite frankly he wasn't at that level. Now Adam, quite frankly, came with that candor to get this kind of puff. Or was Piranesi thinking that Adam would give the approach to architecture which Piranesi was not in himself able to give in Italy, and Adam could therefore be his spokesman? He was getting a young man who had a future ahead of him, who wasn't in reality this already a powerful architect. He could use Adam in this way.
I think the answer is a mixture of both. I think you're absolutely right. There was an opportunist element in Piranesi, that he was aware that Adam had the potential that he himself lacked to carry out many of those ideas. But I think also that Piranesi was a highly commercial animal, and he certainly thought that he would get a great deal of scope by sort of praising up people he was working with. Certainly it's very true, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the monument in the Via Appia, for instance, gives claims in brevity that could never have been justified at the time. My own reading is that Piranesi did recognize in Adam some potential there that he hadn't found in other people, but I think one has to also bear in mind that Piranesi was naming his sort of flag, as it were, to the British mast, having got terribly savaged by the sort of the French faction, who were very much going towards the Greek cause, and in a way he found the British were more open, so to speak, to a more variety, more pluralistic approach. And I think that it is a curious sort of mixture there of opportunism. Piranesi realised, and of course another thing which is equally interesting, John Fleming brings it out brilliantly, is that of course Adam passed himself out for a much more influential and sort of more well-connected person than he actually was. I mean, he is Cavaliere. I was only reading last night how he hires a wonderful coach in green and gilt to make his trip up to Ravenna, for instance, like hiring a rather splendid sports car. He's obviously wanting to cut a fine figure. And of course James later doesn't want to mix with the artists because it sort of demeans them to be with your fellow artists. You want to be Cavaliere and so forth. And I think that to a certain extent Piranesi was taken in by Adam to a certain extent. He was rather flanneling Adam an awful lot in giving the impression he had immense sort of possibilities and resources and so forth. So I think there's an element of deception behind it, but also I think a certain element of vision in Piranesi. He realised that Adam was somebody who would make the big time eventually, and certainly it comes out in Adam's later, Piranesi's later works, that he realises that Adam is beginning to achieve what he himself always wanted to do and was never able to. And almost in a kind of vicarious way, he enjoys seeing the success of his style through Adam's own achievement. The answer, I think, will never be an easy one to unravel, really. They're both highly complicated and both arrogant men in their own way, but they sort of scratched each other's backs, I think. It's a complicated issue. But certainly the Capo Marzio, if I can just finish, is a very significant gesture, I think, by Adam. I can't think of any other instance in the 18th century of a major folio dedicated, instead of a pope in this way, to a fellow architect in quite that way. I mean, it's a remarkable gesture. Now, that's not just a question of Piranesi just, as it were, praising up Adam for his own sake. He obviously realised there was something to be gained out of this. And it's interesting how James, when he comes to Rome, prods Piranesi to get those books out so that they can send them back to England and hand them out, rather like Christmas presents in big firms today, to their customers and clients, as a big puff, as it were, in public relations and so on.
John. My comment, I think, probably is addressed to both Johns. I'm an old skeptic when it comes to Clarissa. And I think the problem with Clarissa is really demonstrated by McCormick in his book, in a way by default. It is quite extraordinary how few of Clarissa's drawings can be accurately dated. I think in the 1750s, barely half a dozen. And when you review all these drawings, how many? 1,000? 2,000? Many. When you review all these drawings, there is no evolutionary trend at all. You find late drawings in the same old-fashioned style of looking at the antique as in some of the early drawings. And perhaps McCormick has not done enough work in attempting to date these drawings by the use of watermarks. I find it very difficult to really identify what central influence Clarissa had on We can see that he was a catalyst in being a sort of bear. We can see from the drawings themselves that Clarissa made that he was peculiar in looking at Roman antiquity in terms of recent excavations. And I think in that one point there is something to be gained. But in everything else, I think Clarissa is old-fashioned. In his own architecture, the Chateau Borrelli, the Metz building is old-fashioned. The design for the Roman house of 73 is even preceded in the same stylistic manner by Erdmannsdorf in his designs for Werners, some of the interiors at Werners. So I'm terribly skeptical. I don't believe Clarissa actually encouraged Adam to make what I call a paper museum. I think Adam's enormous gain in Rome was to recognize, and indeed be one of the first to recognize since the Renaissance, the need for a paper museum. And it may be, perhaps John can tell us this, it may be that this is something
Piranesi's effects when they were catalogued in his death include a vast quantity of material, drawings by Salvador Rose, etc., etc. But there's nothing that suggests that kind of thing in Piranesi's own work in that way, and I haven't found the only evidence of that kind of encouragement. So I think you're right that this is probably something.
But of course he included a chest of drawings by Leger.
Yes, yes. Yes.
I think what you're actually misunderstanding is Clarissa's contribution in a way. You say that Clarissa tried to teach Adam to copy, and I think that's quite wrong. He taught him to look. He certainly taught him to draw, and I think the French academic tradition aimed at teaching people to look at antiquity, to understand the spirit of it, not just simply to imitate and repeat it. I mean, that's very much a sort of British point of view. Burlington's Palladian Revival or something is looking at Palladian drawing or architecture, the Gothic Revival, the Greek Revival, even. That doesn't happen in France. Even if they've looked at these things, they look at Gothic earlier, they look at actually Greek and Doric earlier, but they don't repeat it. They try to penetrate to it. And if you read Leroy, for instance, his whole notion is that you understand the way the forms act upon your sensations and things like that. And it is, I think it's that sort of approach that Clarissa encouraged in Adam in a way. And it took a few years to actually seek through and for Adam to begin to grasp it. I mean, Clarissa clearly is a humble artist, a man of not much creativity himself. But I think what he gave to Adam was part of that actual French tradition of trying to understand architecture in depth rather than merely superficially as a stylistic exercise.
Yes, I certainly would like to accept your reformulation, but clearly I think you made two very important points. One is Clarissa encouraging Adam to look, but Adam was already geared in that direction because he had these publication plans, and that was the sort of English tradition that he was wanting to.
But I mean, Adam had actually sort of one publications at that stage. He was terrified of opening up his ideas to anything like that. The only publication he wanted was some classical thing, real classical antiquity, which would actually establish a reputation.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yes.
And in fact, what we didn't have was in fact the ineptitude of Adam's fantastical drawings in a way. His fantasy was so mediocre and crude in the sketches which he did in Rome and his period. He clearly hadn't actually crystallized either his ideas or his own abilities. I think that's really part of the efficiency.
Yes, this is, and that's why I think that Piranesi's influence may possibly have been unhelpful. What it took Adam so long to do was to assimilate what he learnt, and it's only really in the early 60s that he begins to find his feet and find a personal style, both in terms of planning and in terms of spatial arrangement and in terms of decoration.
I think Stuart is really a sort of key element in that change. As you say, Piranesi was clearly no sound. I agree with Chambers entirely on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stuart must have had a real traumatic effect on Adam when he comes back here. Especially, I think Adam must have gone to Wimbledon, which we now have evidence was probably fully decorated by Stuart. And of course, Stuart comes out of those people associated with the French Academy in Rome in the 1740s when he was there. Of that period, we know very little.
Can I just say that I think one thing that is manifest about Piranesi is what I call the shock therapy. Maybe, in a sense, Adam had to reformulate his ideas afterwards. What I think one can't deny is he shook Adam up in a considerable way that Adam wouldn't have expected. I mean, after all, bear in mind, Adam came from Scotland, as it were, with already buildings behind him. He was a practicing architect. He had a Palladian, as it were, training crossed with a sort of Bambergian sort of dose as well in his father's work. And I think that that sort of catalytic shock is certainly crucial to Adam, even if I take the point that it had to be reformulated by other people in a different way. I do also, I think, in fairness, say that although the French may have been so remarkable, as Robin has pointed out, I think nobody can contest that Stuart's work, particularly the painted room, is exceptionally important if you think of architecture not merely as space, but as a whole ensemble of furniture and interior design. And I think that painted room of 1759 is still the most significant sort of interior of its kind anywhere in Europe. If you look at the French situation, I don't think even the Bureau Club of Le Lorrain and so on, which has been wheeled out so often as a crucial sort of French neoclassical pioneering piece, compares with the sort of thing that Stuart was doing. And I'm talking now about architecture in a more wide sense in terms of interiors, and I thought Peter Thornton here would probably say something in that particular area. I do also think that the French orthodoxy, this very strong academic tradition, in itself could be an extremely difficult thing to combat. Maybe the pragmaticism of the English is something that has its own virtues, and certainly nobody could say that Adam isn't pragmatic in his own way. So I think that he is his own man, if you like, in that respect, even though the French elements, I think, are very important to him as well.
Can I just ask on this point, how convincing, does one know how convincing Clemenceau was as a teacher? Was he a very powerful figure, or was he, do we know the sort of person he was? Whether we can sort of sustain this Robbie view, which I'm sure is very well grounded, of Clemenceau pushing this particular intellectual enterprise.
Well, one can only get... Sorry.
I mean, clearly, Adam having experienced Clemenceau, Chambers having apparently experienced Clemenceau, Adam then wanted him to, Adam had him, and Adam thought it was good enough to have James have him too. It was an ongoing thing. He didn't say he loved him.
But as a draft, as teaching him drawing or teaching him to think.
I think it was a drawing technique, a representational technique, right? But it was also teaching a way of looking at things and analysing things. That's where it was. It wasn't just being dreary sort of terrorism.
As I would say on the Clemenceau thing, how proficient was he as a teacher? Very. It's quite clear that Robert Adam and Clemenceau were extraordinarily close friends. Clemenceau was very, very fond of Robert Adam and was immensely disappointed when James came out, who was of course 7.5 years younger, to Venice, to find that James wasn't a bit interested in this middle-aged Frenchman who'd been hanging around in Venice, whereas Robert and Clemenceau got on very well. I think there was definitely a meeting of minds. And if you look at the many sets of drawings that exist of Clerisot doing the arch at Ancona and Robert doing the arch at Ancona, and again and again and again you compare drawings, you can see how that phrase, the true taste of the antique, Clerisot could see, he could point up, he could work with the ruin that he was drawing and give it a certain presence. And it took Robert Hutton a very long time to learn to see like that and to draw like that. But I'm quite sure myself, they were very, very close friends. Piranesi is fizzling away like an ill-lit firework in Rome the whole time. And Robert is going off on these trips down to Naples and across to Ancona and up to Ravenna and travelling with Clerisot the whole time. I don't see that in any sense the one is irreconcilable with the other. I think they feed in together into the formulation of Adam as an artist. And it seems to me tremendously important that when he arrives in Italy, having all the experience of being a successful architect and working for the Earl of Hopton and the Earl of Greece and government contractor, and feeling already that he's quite a pezzo grosso, he gets to Italy and he realizes that he's just sort of not playing the same game at all. And so I would buy John Fleming's thesis. I think it's absolutely true. He recognizes in Clerisot the ideal master, and in Piranesi the inspirational genius, and the two work together.
A point of comparison between Piranesi and Adam that intrigues me. A point of comparison between Piranesi and Adam that intrigues me is a sense of recombinatory imagination of fragments, almost ready-made fragments that one finds in the fantasies of Piranesi, and in a curious way are replicated, quite literally replicated in Adam, in terms of the mouldings that were made. You can, as it were, recombine in an almost kind of prefabricated modular way the decorations that Jackson still has them, so that you could, if you went sort of haywire, as it were, with these Adam mouldings, produce a kind of Piranesian kind of fantastic collage of them, so that the fragmentation of Piranesi and the itemization, as it were, of discrete fragments that compose his capriccios and combinations of stones and of surfaces comes up seemingly in a kind of quasi, in a sort of manner of production and of prefabrication and replication in Adam. But it's entirely to do with medium and mode of production and consumption with Adam.
I would certainly agree that one of the problems when people try and look at the relationship of Piranesi and Adam is, of course, that Adam obviously makes a huge selection from the fund of ideas of Piranesi. I mean, you're right in the sense that great collage thrown up. It's a sort of mind-blowing, as it were, experience for him to be faced with so many alternatives through Piranesi, but it's very necessary to get away from Piranesi, I'm sure that's true, to somebody who can sort things out, as it were, and to really begin to form a meaningful and coherent style. And I think, as Alistair has said, I think it was necessary to have two types of mentor, really, working together. The furious and fantastic Venetian hints and so on certainly were pretty frustrating, I'm sure of that. And I'm sure that we needed the other side, as we heard in that kind of way.
I think old Clarissa was fawning and subservient.
We've heard a lot about We've heard a lot about antique, but I mean, I think that a room like the painted room at Spencer House and a lot of the interiors of Adam later on, which we'll hear about from Eileen, would be quite impossible without the Renaissance. I mean, clearly, Stuart somehow, I mean, obviously, knew Raphael's Loggia pretty well to have produced the painted room at Spencer House. So the question one has to ask is, does Adam take up this idea of Renaissance decoration when he's in England, or is he given the clue while he's in Italy? And if he is given the clue while he's in Italy, could it have come from Piranesi, which seems to be rather unlikely? Could it have come from Clericeau? I don't know the answer to that. But certainly, Adam's interior design is quite impossible without the inventions of Renaissance wall painting.
I absolutely agree with that. The Villa Madama surely must lie behind Spencer House, and so must Pura Gregorius Casino. I should have thought they were very important indeed. One doesn't tend to forget how much the people actually owe to the Renaissance and not just to the classical 18th. Very much. Particularly of Piazzi and Forte.
I think that the Peruzzi side, if you like, the Ligorio side, is certainly helped by Piranesi's intervention, because if you look at the Knights of Malta's Church, that I was looking at it only about a week ago in Rome, it's amazing actually how close it is to mannerism. And clearly Piranesi testifies to Peruzzi and Ligorio frequently as one of his own sources of inspiration. I'm sure he helped Adam towards this, but certainly there isn't so much evidence, I admit, towards the painted ornament of Cinquecento and Villa Madama and so on, which is crucial to Adam. I agree there.
But there is a set of Domenico dei Rossi engravings of the Galleria by Raphael, and they were at Clare Adam, so I really don't see that as a great problem.
Also, I think that it's an English tradition, the British tradition. John Harris talked about the painting museum, and this was the Clericeau idea. I mean, I wonder how much Adam was aware of the British tradition of John Tallman going out and painting the museum, continued by people like and meet indeed Burlington, drawing great collections. And I think he was talking about the Renaissance tradition, the British back when helped get Kent and with Burlington. I wonder how much he's looking too much to continental, the Italians and the French, how much Adam's approach to the antique and the Renaissance is in fact what the British tradition set out by Kent, Burlington, and by Tallman.
I mean, I think Charles is correct here that in England, and one says this without a great knowledge of architects' collections in, say, Italy or France in the later 17th century and the early 18th century, except for Nicodemus Tessin in Stockholm. There's no doubt that Tessin was acquiring drawings that were intended to be used as precedents and objects to copy in the building of the Stockholm Royal Palace and other buildings. But there does seem to be in England this peculiar tradition which may well have as its catalyst the antiquarian tradition in England. This, the great Towerman collection, Lord Burlington making a particular point of bringing together this, again, a paper museum. It's a very peculiar, as far as outside England is concerned, it's a very peculiar circumstance for an architect to deliberately build up, collect drawings, many drawings of architects or representing a style that you admire and wish to emulate. But it needs a lot more work.
Sorry, last question is here.
The point was made about Piranesi's interest in high Renaissance architects. Piero Ligori has been mentioned. We saw a picture of the loggia from the Palazzo del Te of Giulio Romano. Giulio makes the point in which I'm interested. In my view, he'd clearly be the great morphological artist of that period. He was interested in space and form, the great geometrician. Looking at the culture, as you point out, you can hardly doubt that there is profound interest by Piranesi in this style. And yet, why? In his only executed work of architecture, is it such a very, very flat facade covered with an absolute profusion of, if you like, engravers. It's very much an engraver's piece of architecture.
My answer would be go to Rome if you can find the time within the next 4 weeks before the exhibition is over, because in the Academy we brought together the Lateran drawings from the Avery Library in Columbia, where you can see Piranesi as a spatialist, if I can use that word, as opposed to the flat man. Because, of course, obviously the problem with the Knights of Malta's church, it was a box, it was an existing structure, and he simply had to embellish, and as far as he could, make it more interesting inside. I mean, spatially, he does do something with a very wonderful altar and a screen of attached columns to give something of the idea which he was trying to do, of course, on a very large scale at the Lateran at the same time. The St. John Lateran designs are incredibly interesting in terms of Piranesi using space. And if it had actually come about, we would have changed our view very much about Piranesi and planning. And certainly the relationship with Boronini, who was very closely concerned with in culminating that great nave with something appropriate to the Seicento in that sense. So I think, I'm afraid, the Priorato Church doesn't do Piranesi great service in terms of what he would like to have achieved. He was given that. He did the best with the limited resources he had. But my goodness, what a thing the Lateran would have been if it had been produced. And as I say, there are plenty of reproductions of those incredible designs to show that he did have that spatial ability.
He was also trying to get back towards the Baptist school. That's part of what determines those forms in the Piranesi plans. Hence the biggest pattern.
Yeah.
Not just conceptual planning.
I'm afraid we're going to have to close down the Italian section of this conference, and we're going to come now to Eileen Harris, who's going to talk about the Adam furnished interior. Eileen Harris, as you probably all know, has written on a book on the furniture of Robert Adam, and probably you're all very familiar with her recent British architectural books and writers, which has so much in it that just about everybody needs it. Eileen Harris.
My present work on Adam's furnished interiors is not far enough advanced for me to be able to give you a properly digested account of this very large subject, including most of Adam's work, in just 40 minutes. Rather than fall back on old generalizations, which seem to me to hinder the progress of Adam's studies, I've decided to focus on just one house, Syon, which I'm sure you all know. Indeed, some of you may think that it has been done and there's nothing more to be said. Well, I must admit that until a few months ago, I was somewhat of that opinion myself, thinking that I had said it all in the draft chapter I had written for my forthcoming book. Well, I was wrong, and what follows is something of a cautionary tale. First, a belated search of post-Adam papers at ANAC answered lingering doubts about work traditionally ascribed to Adam, proving it to be later. Then, a controversial idea put to me by Robin Middleton regarding Adam's plan published in the Works led me to consider the interiors before they were transformed by Adam. While I hope to be able to advance your knowledge of Syon a bit this morning, there are still some unresolved questions to which you might have the answers, or you might raise more questions. Let's begin with Adam's engraved plan, published in 1773, but retrospectively dated 1761. What was constructed is shown in solid black, what was proposed is hatched. Before examining this, well, that's only partly the case actually, before examining this and considering Robin's observations, I should like to show you the only two other surviving plans, earlier ones, both in the Syon archive. The first one on your left dates from the early 17th century. The quadrangle with 4 towers is the earlier building. You can see that. There are the towers. That's the earlier building. These service wings were added later and later still removed. The early history of Syon is extremely confusing, and I cannot go into it in detail today. I only want to point out a few things. The 2 entrances to the hall, there and there with the screens passage and stairs to the right, which, as you see from the engraved plan, were removed by Adam. Here's the hall. 1 entrance and no stairs, so a short flight of stairs. The stairs in the north range, well, both of these, about which I know very little as yet. At present, the main stairs are in the northwest corner behind the hall. This, and then the stairs in the east range, going from the court up to the lawn gallery. This, as you see in the engraved plan, was made to a circular stair, or proposed as a circular stair, and was in fact enlarged and taken up to the first floor. Also note the 2 entrances, well, the 3 entrances to the gallery, 2 at the far ends, 1 in the center, and the chimney pieces there and there. Finally, the 3 rooms on the south range, with windows on both sides and chimneys on the outer wall. The windows on the north side, on the court side, were later blocked but left visible from the court, and the chimneys were moved over. Now, despite the large sums of money that had been spent on the house at various times in the 17th century, it was found to be ruinous and inconvenient in 1750, when Sir Hugh Smithson succeeded his father-in-law as Earl of Northumberland. 16 years later, he became the first Duke. In 1751, Smithson started making alterations to the principal bedrooms above the gallery. 3 rooms in the north block: the dining room, drawing room, and a so-called anteroom, or a so-called green room, which I think was probably an anteroom. There are bills from the carver James Whittle for gilding ceilings and chimney pieces here, and for supplying 5 gilt lanterns for the staircase between 1752 and 1754. Adam's plan shows the existing dining room there on the west side of his proposed grand stair, and on the other side of the grand stair, the drawing room, he proposed to make into the Duchess's dressing room or boudoir in conjunction with her state bedroom that he planned behind the gallery. That being her state bedroom, an anteroom, and the Duchess's boudoir, the grand stair, and the dining room in the private wing. Now, none of this was realized, and at present, that north block contains a large private dining room and drawing room. Now, the other plan, I said there were two, is inscribed, which is on your left. The other plan is inscribed, alterations for Syon House forming a great apartment. This is an unfinished preliminary plan showing existing partition walls and stairs, Adam's proposed stairs drawn in faint pencil, and new work in black. It shows the hall as first proposed. Sorry, that's on your right. And this is Adam's elevations of the hall and the plan related to that. And the hall, as shown there, has an apse with a fireplace at the north end and a wall at the south end with a central door into the old screens passage, where Adam proposed new stairs. There's the door into this old screens passage, where Adam proposed new stairs in to replace the old stairs which you saw in the previous plan, in order to make the columnar vestibule. Now, the old south block at that time contained 4 rooms and another staircase, all of which was this one. This was one room, another room, that, and the staircase. Now, all of that was removed and the space divided into 2 very large rooms. The dining room, with screened apses each end and niches on the inner wall, more or less as executed, except for the window in the far apse. This is a combination of my drawing and somebody else's tracing. There. That was opened into a window where there was an old chimney. Evidently, there were adjustments to other windows on that front, evening out the irregular widths of the piers. Beyond the dining room is the drawing room, taken all the way back to the gallery. Obviously, rooms of this length required proportional height, which was obtained by taking space from the floor above. The preliminary plan and the hall and dining room elevations, I can't show you the dining room one, cannot be later than 1761, when ceiling designs had been made and building work was in progress, particularly in the dining room. They were probably made before July 1760, when Robert wrote to James in Rome, telling him of Nathaniel Curzon's idea of a publication of his works, Adam's works, in which Adam thought of including his work for Northumberland. Now I want to examine the engraved plan and consider firstly Adam's misleading description of it, and then Robin's observations. According to Adam, the rotunda, or grand saloon as he called it, was to serve as a general rendezvous and round-point leading to the grand stair in the private apartment on the north, and through what he calls a circular back stair into the center of the gallery. Which, he says, the gallery, was for the reception of company before dinner, or for the ladies to retire to after, the drawing room being a buffer against the noise of the men in the dining room. Here, to remind you, is the dining room, drawing room, and gallery. So you are meant to go into the hall, through the rotunda, through the center of the stair, and into the gallery, and then proceed to the dining room, and then back. Now, the circuit he describes is the opposite of what it was and still is, and would have ended in what he calls the anteroom. So obviously, at the end of all this, you come back there, or out through the rotunda. Now, this anteroom, he says, Adam says, was for the attendance of servants out of livery and tradesmen. But can one really believe that unliveried servants and tradesmen on private business were to be left to wait in the state apartment? It seems most unlikely. Then what was the function of this first room, what Adam calls the anteroom? It was referred to in the accounts as the vestibule, and that is the name it retains. However, it has a fireplace and had seats, and was not a room just to pass through as vestibules normally are. Two contemporary visitors, Lady Shelburne in 1765 and Mary Anderson in 1770, described it as a saloon. Though it is not as large as most saloons, it is magnificently decorated and is the only room, apart from the hall, that could have been used as a reception room before dinner. The hall was probably used in the several ways Isaac Ware recommended, as a reception room for larger parties, as a waiting room for people of second rank, and as a cool summer dining room. Now, the absence of any direct communication between the vast proposed rotunda and the state apartment on the south block led Robin to conclude, quite rightly, I think, that the rotunda was not part of the 1760 or 61 plan, but was added later, most probably after the grand fete given for the King of Denmark in October 1768. On that occasion, the court was fitted up, according to the Duke, as a grand saloon, with niches for bands of musicians and triumphal arches with transparent paintings across the niches in the four corners, the whole costing upwards of £3,000. I'm less convinced by Robin's idea that the state apartment is an adaptation of a French arrangement, with the dining room off the vestibule. Its peculiarities seem to me to have been mainly determined by the existing quadrangular building. While it is true that Adam praised the French for their proper arrangement and relief of apartments, in which he said they excelled all other nations, he nevertheless warned against imitating their dining rooms, which he said seldom or never constitute a piece in their great apartments, but lie out of the suite. I presume he was referring to the typical symmetrical French plan, which has a central entrance vestibule with a saloon immediately behind it, and the great apartment with a chambre de parade and so forth on one side, and the dining room and anterooms on the opposite side. In any event, there are few 18th century French dining rooms the size of the one at Syon. Peter Thornton is our expert on distribution, and I hope he might have something to say about the Syon plan. Before that, we should look at the individual rooms. The state apartment at Syon was intended from the outset to house Northumberland's growing collection of antique sculpture, much of which was acquired through James Adam in Rome. His picture collection was housed in Northumberland House in the Strand, in the new gallery finished in 1757. Related to the concentration on sculpture is the frequent use of synthetic materials to imitate marble and bronze. I shall point that out as we go along. Had the vast rotunda been built, it would have been the principal repository for sculpture. As it was, the hall served that purpose. It was more severe and stone-like than it is now, stuccoed and left white when Lady Shelburne saw it in 1765. The subtle pink tinge of the walls, with the mouldings picked out in pale grey and blue, are John Fowler's colours applied in 1972. The principal attractions are the marble copy of the Apollo Belvedere in the niche, and Vallardier's superb bronze cast of the dying Gaul between the columns in the square recess. The Duchess, who was forever making lists of what things cost, included in her whole list the consoles under the spiral fluted columns, for which £100 was paid. More interesting than their cost is the relation of these columns and consoles to the one prominently featured on the frontispiece to Adam's book on Spalatro, which was being prepared for publication at exactly this moment in 1760 and 61. Though we now know to treat what Adam wrote in the works with some caution, we must agree with him that there is much more diversity of form and play of light and shadow in the arched recess with its screen of columns than there was in his first design, which I had shown you. And that this does, as he said, give additional picturesque to the scene. The engraving on your left, probably drawn after 1769, when the dying Gaul was put in place, shows the stage-set view as Adam wanted it to be seen, with the vestibule as a backdrop, repeating the columns in the recess, and thus extending the illusion of space. The view from the vestibule on your right back into the hall has a similar effect. Adam's sense of movement is largely pictorial and not a little theatrical. Apart from the furniture, the vestibule, as you see it today, corresponds almost exactly to the description of it given by Mary Anderson in 1770. You would never know that the entire room was dissembled in 1831 when it was repainted, recarved and regilded at vast expense and given a new, imperishable scagliola floor of the same colours and pattern as Adam's original. This was provided by William Croghan, successor to Mrs. Code. The vestibule is one of Adam's most resplendent creations, doubtlessly intended to convey an idea of the opulence both of the Romans and the Northumberlands. It is also a display of Adam's remarkable ingenuity in transforming the rectangular space into a square by the simple measure of bringing the columns on the south side, the window side and the right-hand side, 6 feet further forward than the others, and in using these projecting Verd antique columns, which were acquired by James in Rome, to carry freestanding figures in the manner of a triumphal arch. The resemblance to the south front of Kedleston, designed in 1760, is obvious. In contrast to the stony white hall, here green and gold are the predominant colours, and the materials are real or imitation marble and metal. There are gilded stucco trophies of armour, made by Joseph Rose, gilded statues, gilt capitals and bases to the columns and pilasters, bronze casts by Valadier in the niches, and above Wilton's exceptional white marble chimney-piece, a large stucco medallion painted to look like bronze. Those, oh, no. No, that's it. Those in the know might have recognized the spirit of Piranesi in this recreation of the rich variety and magnificence of ancient Rome in miniature. They might even have understood Adam's motive in taking the Greek Ionic capital from the Erechtheum, which was published for the very first time by Leroy in 1758, and improving it by the addition of Roman ornaments, as a deliberate endorsement of Piranesi's retaliation to the French author's dismissal of Roman Ionic columns as poor and defective. On the left is Adam's Ionic order, published in the Works, and I think engraved by Piranesi, and on the right, Piranesi's polemical plate, published in the Magnificenza in 1761, depicting a copy from Leroy in the center, with the Ionic order from the Erechtheum, flanked by a variety of Roman capitals. Now, archaeological accuracy and Athenian architecture, which were both in very high esteem at that particular moment, were anathemas to Adam. As I said, the furnishing of the vestibule is not as it was, nor is it easy to reconstruct. The difficulty, which affects all the staterooms, stems first from the making of replicas as well as repairs in 1830, then from the arrival of most of the furniture from Northumberland House when it was demolished in 1874, the Empire furniture, which you saw in a previous slide in the center of the room, came from Northumberland House, and finally from the continuous moving of pieces, which you may notice in my slides. The two tables shown on your left, under the trophies, belong in the dining room. The third table, under the niche on the west wall, which you can't see, is a documented replica. As you see from the engraved elevation on the right, the room originally had only one table, which was placed under the niche opposite the entrance, and which was described by Mary Anderson as having a gilt frame and a purple and white marble table. The Duke's rough list of things wanted for the room includes a table 7 feet wide, which is nearly the size of the table on your right, now in the hall in front of the Dying Gaul. This has been painted white and has an inlaid marble top. Nevertheless, it could conceivably have come from the vestibule. Stools were also on the Duke's list. Mary Anderson noted 3 gilt chairs upholstered in white floral needlework, which must be the 3 needlework settees in the 1847 inventory. These have not yet been identified. The furnishing of the dining room is easier to put right. The pair of pier glasses, designed by Adam in 1765, should be accompanied by the tables under the trophies. These, I apologize for the bad slide, these, I believe, were made to Adam's design on your right. But in the 1830 restoration, the plain white ground of the frieze was enriched with gilded reeding, giving the tables a later look. The sculpture gallery at Holcombe, on your left, with its half-domed apses at each end, and niches filled with statues on either side of the chimney piece, is the model for the Syon dining room. Sculpture, or panels of stucco work, were considered by Adam to be the most suitable decorations for eating rooms, as they do not retain odors. The dark reddish-brown color of the niches and the mushroom pink of the walls are unfortunate. The room was originally painted white and picked out in gold in the French style. The heavy architectural chimney piece may look a bit old-fashioned for Adam, but it is, I think, a deliberate attempt on his part to focus attention on the center of the room in order to counterbalance its excessive length, which is 3 times its width. The 3-part division of the ceiling has the same effect, and so too do the screened apses, though their contribution to the picturesque is as important here as it was in the hall. The drawing room, in its pristine state, was a spectacular set piece, a display of the Duchess's notorious ostentation that nowadays would be called over the top. Though age has considerably mellowed it, the effect is still stunning. Let's start with the coved ceiling, which as usual was done first. After 3 unsuccessful proposals, including one for 3 large compartments, like the dining room ceiling, the overall pattern of coffering, inset with circular paintings, reminiscent of the Villa Madama, was decided upon in 1762. The paintings were done by Cipriani, mainly from plates in the Antiquità de Ercolano Espositi. Unlike virtually every other Adam ceiling, this one was never repeated, being prohibitively expensive. Now have a close look at, sorry, I should have, have a close look at the embroidered chimney-piece. I cannot improve upon Bolton's description of its ormolu enrichments as an overdress of brass lace thrown upon a white marble form. Thomas Carter was paid £282 for the marble form and the carved moulds for the ormolu mounts. Over and above that was the cost of the ormolu itself. There was nothing in England like this at that date. The founder was probably Deirdre Nicholas Anderson, who also supplied the medals that were added to the ormolu arabesques thrown over the extravagant ivory pilasters flanking the doors on the right. Even the shutters, which you see on the left, are enriched with ormolu ornaments. According to Mary Anderson, the chimney-piece had a hearth of inlaid marble of different colors. It is no longer there, but who knows, it may be rediscovered on a table. Above the bedecked chimney-piece is a large mirror in a gilt frame designed by Adam, which I suspect had girandoles and more ornaments at the sides than it has now. Even so, it is small fry compared to Adam's mirrors on the opposite wall. Their glasses, which are over 9 feet tall and 5 feet wide, were said by the Duke to be the largest ever seen in England. They were bought for him in Paris by Walpole's friend, the fashionable wit and politician, George Selwyn. Jean Bruno Guichard, a French carver working in London, supplied the frames at a cost of £123, almost double that charged by most English carvers. Mary Anderson thought their narrowness showed the glasses to great advantage, and I think she had a point. The maker of the accompanying ram's head tables is not known. Their design was engraved and published in the Works in 1822. This design replaced an earlier one with female heads, which the Duke said reminded him of a family pew or a supper box for a ball with the ladies' heads peering out over the top. The rejected design was passed to the Earl of Coventry and was executed for Croom Court, and there it is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. One would be excused for overlooking the table's mosaic slabs, said to have come from the Baths of Titus, as the eye is automatically drawn to the impressive, overwhelming red silk damask hangings, with its large pattern of silvery white and green flowers. According to the Duke, this three-colored damask was the first of its kind ever executed in England, presumably at Spitalfields. It was, however, an imported French fashion, exclusive to the very grandest drawing rooms, to be accompanied only by large, vastly expensive looking glasses, not by pictures. The fabric is now reversed and has come and is too worn now to be without pictures. In 1829, the 50-year-old fabric was taken down and sent to Annick. New hangings